All right. And Ann, let's do a poll before we start to see how our audience is thinking and to test some of their ADA knowledge. Um, Go ahead and pull that poll up for us. And I can't see it from where I'm at, so let me just escape for a second. Um, so how many adults in the U.S. currently live with a disability? Why don't you give us your thought on that, whether it's 5, 10, or whatever. And while we're doing that, boy, Bill, thanks so much, Chris, thanks so much for that information. You're a man after my own heart, and boy, we could speak a lot on the public right of way. My specialty is I retired from the Colorado Department of Transportation as the ADA statewide ADA coordinator, and now I'm with HDR doing national public right of way guideline requirements, and that is my specialty. Is those issues in that public right of way and any constraints and site constraints in the design of that, and how do we get around that and make it ADA compliant. Any results for our poll as of yet? All right, so some people think it's 60%, some people say it's 40. The majority says 25, and that is actually correct. 25% of adults in the US currently live with disability. Um, and I'm going to go back and start my thing here. And this is my 15 minutes. So again, we can talk on this for hours and days and days. So I'll do the background of the ADA. You'll hear a lot of the same stuff. Um, and we'll do the settlements a little bit like what Chris talked about, responsibility for state and local agencies, do some self-evaluation and plan review, and then GIS's role and how that is just so monumental with regards to that. So this chart is from the CDC that shows us the breakdown of functional disability types amongst adults in America. And if you're doing the math and thinking that numbers don't add up to 25% or 1 in 4, like we talked about, remember that a person could fall into more than one of these categories. And furthermore, once those adults hit age 65, approximately 2 in 5 or 40% can be classified as having at least one form of disability. So again, jumping back on Chris's information is, the effective communication for persons who are blind or have visual impairments is growing with regards to the public right of way, and you are seeing requirements for accessible pedestrian signals, locator tones, so that I can find that push button and push it and cross that street and things of that sort. And we'll get a little bit into that coming up here. So let's talk about the federal laws that we're looking at. 1964, the Civil Rights Act was based on race, religion, color, and national origin, and the discrimination of that. And then we have the 1968 Architectural Barriers Act, which were required for federal buildings, for accessibility in federal buildings. And then in 1973, the Rehab Act, Section 504, basically said, for federal services, programs, and activities, and not just buildings, that we will not discriminate against those persons with disabilities. And then in 1987, there were issues where some municipalities were saying, well, this doesn't affect our certain department. Well, if you get any funding, federal funding or state funding, it affects your whole program. So it's not just that. So the 87 Civil Rights Reauthorization Act said, look, it doesn't matter what department gets the money. If you get federal or state funds, you shall not be discriminatory against persons with disabilities. And then obviously, right, that civil rights law, the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, came into effect and changed the way we look at it. So again, Section 504 talks about, no otherwise qualified individual with a disability, right, shall solely by reason of her or his disability be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or be subjected to that discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And in 1990, when the ADA came in, it says, look, no qualified individual with a disability shall be the same thing, right? Excluded from participation or be denied the benefits of services, programs, or activities of a public entity or be subjected to discrimination by any such entity. So it went from financial assistance to services, programs, or activities under the ADA. So where before Section 504 said it was specific to programs and activities receiving federal funding, the ADA changed it all and said the Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination based on a disability regardless of the funding source. So we talk about this, right? In 1990, George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, prohibiting the discrimination of any person on the basis of disability. While this did a lot to improve quality of life for people with disabilities, It's been 33 years since the ADA has been signed, and public entities still have not met the requirements to alleviate those barriers in their program, services, and activities, what Krista talked about. And so we're going to beat that up a little bit. The ADA is written into 5 major titles, including sections on employment, state and local government services, which is Title II, which we talk about, which specifically I deal with for the most part. Places of public accommodation, that Title III, such as restaurants and shopping centers, your Home Depots, Taco Bells and things like that. Uh, Title communications, such as telephone and internet. And 5th, miscellaneous section that gave the United States Access Board the ability to develop these design guidelines. And we can go into detail of all of these if we need to after the Q&A. So what do municipalities need to know? They need to be aware that facilities like sidewalks, curb ramps, crosswalks, push buttons, pedestrian signals, as Chris talked about, fall within the public right of way, fall within the Department of Justice's definition of a program or service, meaning those facilities need to be accessible and maintained in operable working conditions. I love the fact that you talked about snow, Chris, because in Colorado here, a lot of that is the municipality or the DOT will take care of the streets, and then maybe the landowner has to deal with the right of way and deal with cleaning up their sidewalks, and then you've got this pyramid of snow. Again, those facilities must be maintained under the federal Code of Federal Regulations. The ADA accessibility guidelines, that 1991 ADA or ADAG, as amended to the latest 2010 ADA standards for accessible design, were developed primarily for buildings and on-site facilities for state and local entities and places of public accommodation. While they address certain features that may be common to public sidewalks, they do not adequately cover elements that are unique to the public right-of-way. The Architectural Barriers Act of 1968 and the latest version of the ABA, which is the 2015 ABA standards, which includes new provisions for outdoor developed areas, including trails and beach access routes, require that buildings and facilities designed, built, altered, or leased with federal funds be accessible to persons with disabilities. 4 agencies have established the ABA standards according to the guidelines issued by the Access Board, the Department of Defense, Department of Housing, Urban Development, General Services Administration, and the U.S. Postal Service. The ADA standards that you see in the center there for transportation facilities of 2006 apply to facilities used by state and local governments that provide designated public transportation services, including bus stops and stations and rail stations. These standards are very closely based on the ADA guidelines to the left there on top, but include additional requirements concerning locations of accessible routes, detectable warnings on curb ramps, which is huge and can be a conversation we can get into at the back end here, and then bus boarding and alighting areas, and rail stations and platforms. To the right here, you see the proposed public right-of-way accessibility guidelines for pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way, or PROAG, which is considered best practice per federal highways for pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way, and have been submitted to the Office of Finance and Management and Budget, as Chris stated, and over 30 plus DOTs have adopted these guidelines and updated their standards to follow this, because again, those state and local government, the ADA and the ABA, those to the left there, and as well as the transportation facilities of 2006 were developed primarily for buildings and facilities. So it didn't speak great for the public right-of-way. Let me move to the next. So which guidelines or standards does your city or town follow? How does that affect both of your existing and newly constructed sidewalks, your curb ramps, your pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way, your PED push buttons? Do you have an accessible pedestrian signal policy? What are those requirements? Are you following the DOT's guidelines? If your city or town has adopted those, typically if they don't have some, they'll adopt the DOT's. And remember, federal funds fall under the Architectural Barriers Act, or the ABA, and state and local entities fall under that ADAG, or the 2000 ADA standards. So again, you might be looking at, are they ABA or ADA based on the state funding or federal funding? But again, they are very close with regards to the requirements under the buildings. So in 2010, at the 20th anniversary of the ADA, all of the federal agencies kind of got together and recommitted and decided to start taking actions against entities that were not complying with the ADA requirements. Here we are 33 years later, and you're already getting the results of that. Very little percentages of small towns and public entities are following that requirement under the ADA. So under the stewardship agreement, you may find yourself getting contacted by the DOT to say, hey, where are your transition plans? How far are you? And things like that under that Title II requirement. So let's talk about these Supreme Court decisions, right? Title One, which is employment settlements. Typically, they're split, based on the complainant or the defendant. But if you look close, Title II under the state and local governments, they've all been wins for the complainants with zero losses. So what does that say, right? Us as public entities, if you're with a small city, state, or town, um, these ADA lawsuits have surged across the country, both for Title I and for Title II. And we need to talk about, why are we there? Some of this thing you're going to hear again, we talked about the city of Sacramento. They were required to do 20% of their transportation funds over 30 years on their sidewalk, curb ramps, and crosswalks. This was in 2003. Another settlement was the city of Chicago. We just heard about 50 million over 5 years for curb ramp improvements in 2007. In 2009, Caltrans, 1.1 billion over 30 years on their sidewalks, crosswalks, and park and ride facilities. 2015, City of Los Angeles, 1.3 billion over 30 years on sidewalks and other accessibility barriers. So you're hearing this trend here, right? And in 2016, here locally for me, in City of Denver, County of Denver, they're required to build 1,500 curb ramps per year until compliant curb ramps are in place at all locations within the city. Now, another one, Oregon Department of Transportation in 2016 agreed to address 25,000 plus curb ramps across their state in their regions and 1,500 signals by 2023. Now, those signals include what? Those pedestrian push buttons that are typically not accessible if you look at them. And or there's no locator tones, or they don't speak or have locator, or chirps or ticking during the walk phase. So far in 2017, they spent 5 million, and they're committing 18 million during the next 2018 to 21 STIP. And then PennDOT in 2009, their lawsuit prompted DOT to spend 820 million over 10 years to replace and fix and address their curb ramps. So where's this all coming from? Well, a lot of it is people complaining, or the DOJ, right? They have this Project Civic Access. We call that DOJ SWAT team. Look this up in your state. I added this link here so that you can see and find out, is your city or town under settlement? You're going to click on your state. You're going to realize there's already been settlements out there. And the timelines to get the accessibility requirements up to par are sometimes 60, 90, or 180 days for compliance, or for barrier removal, right? Those physical barriers, or maybe it's nothing more than a physical. It's a communication barrier. And notice the latest dates of settlements in your state, and which cities and towns are involved. So let's get into the nitty gritty. We can talk about this typically for days, but we got 15 minutes. So under ADA Title II requirements for public entities, that's public funds. These are the 5 things we look at. Here's the foundation on which we gauge where our clients are with respect to the ADA compliance. And these are primarily state and local entities. Notice I highlighted included curb ramp schedule on the bottom. We'll get to that in a few slides coming up. But again, that ADA notice, a grievance procedure, right? I did show these 50 or more employee requirements, but typically I try not to look at that. And I say, look, if you're a small city or town, you should really have some form of all of this. But again, adopt a grievance procedure, designate a responsible employee that somebody can call to and talk to and contact. We'll get into a little bit here after this. Conduct that self-evaluation of your program services and activities and make those reasonable modifications. And then develop that transition plan, right, for that schedule for those barrier removals. So let's talk about real quick 1 and 2. Publish an ADA notice. We will not discriminate against people based on their disability, and have that in the correct places. And then have that grievance procedure. Someone that can file a complaint. Is that on your website? Who's the point of contact? Timelines for that complaint process, and an appeal process as well. If somebody doesn't like that, their complaint wasn't heard, they should have an appeal process. And again, we can speak on this for hours and get a little bit more, a lot more into detail, but we're limited to 15 minutes here. Number 3, right? Designate a responsible employee, that ADA coordinator. Is this person on the website? Is it on, or is he or she on the notices or application? Is there at least a link and phone number on your website? First thing I do is look at your website and search ADA coordinator, grievance procedure, transition plan. Try to get in there, find out what does this town, city or town have. Many times nothing comes up, and many times I get the HR coordinator who may deal with only hiring and firing, which is that Title I or job postings, and not deal with any other access issues. The self-evaluation in itself, right? That self-evaluation is to evaluate your policies, practices, and procedures and look at reasonable modifications for that versus that transition plan, right? We've looked at all this and, well, there's a lot of structural and communication barriers, and how are we going to schedule to remove these? Because typically, this doesn't take overnight. We're looking at 5, 10, 15, sometimes up to 30 years to deal with this transition plan. So that's self-evaluation, right? We evaluate the agency's current services, policies, and practices that potentially limit those access for persons with disabilities to those public services. We provide an opportunity to include those individuals with disabilities or organizations that represent them to participate in that self-evaluation process by submitting comments. And then we make that self-evaluation available for public inspection. Now, again, that could be ordinance, that could be verbiage, it could be applications, it could be something that says you're required to have a driver's license to do something. Well, a lot of people with disabilities don't drive. So, do we have to make those modifications to those policies? That transition plan, right? You've identified those obstacles that limit access for persons with disabilities in those programs, services, and activities. You describe how in detail how you're going to be used to correct those deficiencies. You specify a schedule, could be, like I said, 5, 10, 15, 30 years. Indicate the official responsible for implementing that plan. And it may be more than one person. We typically recommend a liaison and a team from each department, or at least 1 or 2 people from each department, to help that ADA coordinator uh, develop and implement that plan. We make that transition plan available for public inspection. I recommend a landing page for a transition plan for your entity. And then you monitor that document that process, so that if DOJ or Federal Highways or whomever comes to you, you could say, here's our plan, and then provide those people that are interested to participate in the process on that website, or whether it's going out and reaching and having public involvement and having public meetings. That's a great way to do it. Or surveys, that's also a great way to do it. And then I highly recommend an ADA advisory board or group. If you have someone in the town that's, they're a complainant and they know what they're talking about, add them to your advisory group, make them part of your solution versus, that's that gal or that guy that always complains. How many curb ramps does your city or town have? Are they documented? Do you have an existing GIS showing areas where there are no curb ramps but should be? How many miles of sidewalk do you have? Is it categorized? Collector, arterial, or residential? How many signalized and non-signalized intersections do you have? Even though DOJ recommends this existing curb ramp priority numbered in the slide here, maybe your public meetings and your public input on your surveys changes that priority in which curb ramps are addressed, or push buttons, or access to, rec centers or parks. So allow that public to give that feedback and be involved in the process. Oregon Department of Transportation has maintained transparency with respect to their 2016 settlement. It's here on their website. Here's their website, the appendixes from the final settlement agreement. I mean, be very transparent. Say, look, we know we have all these curb ramps, right? And they're in all these states, and we have no push buttons here, or we have push buttons, but they're not accessible. The more transparent you are with the public, the more the public says, look, they get it, and they got a plan to fix these accessibility issues. I would definitely, you can look at some other DOTs that have been under settlement, but have that on your website. As part of the DOT's settlement and as a requirement under the ADA, they've provided a curb ramp schedule that's required under 28 CFR Part 35, and they've included pedestrian push buttons in their assessment and scheduled to review, categorize, and replace both types of these pedestrian facilities. Great information. They broke it down by regions. Again, as highlighted here, ODOT will comply with they will complete an updated inventory of their curb ramps on their state highway system by December 17th, 31st, 2017. So they had a year after that, right, to go through and inventory their curb ramps and prioritize them, right? So once this is completed, the locations of these non-compliant curb ramps in the updated curb ramp inventory shall constitute the universe of curb ramp locations that ODOT agrees to remediate. So you don't want to find yourself under this daunting schedule. So again, be transparent, identify where your ped facilities are at if you have authority over that, and we'll talk a little bit about how to prioritize them here in a second. So we have an internal you may have both an internal and an external GIS that the public can see to see the where's the state of the union for your curb ramps, right? For an instance, from this one, this is the DOT. You can have all kinds of things about what kind of funding is here, what type of ramp is here, what type of level of design, all of the geometrics of the width of that curb ramp, the curb height, the gutter width, the gutter slope, the slope of the ramp. So all that stuff. There's a lot of information. There may be some things that the public doesn't want to see. They may just want to know, is this compliant? And if not, when am I going to get to it? Or what part is compliant? And what are your notes saying in this one? This says remove and replace ramp 3 with a compliant ramp, remove and replace curb and gutter. So as we go through this, you may have some more information for the public or less information for the public and more internally. The external public facing GIS site can be modified, like I said, to be user-friendly, convey the conditions of the existing curb ramp and sidewalk, the PED signals, push buttons, or even just bus and transit stops in your area of responsibility. A lot of times that's missed. In the 1991 ADA guidelines, we were required to have access from these bus transit stops, and they were supposed to be accessible, but we find across the country that they are not. And so again, communicate with your transit agency or with that regional transportation district when they're placing these bus stops, that they're accessible and they're placed in accessible routes from the street or the corner. Here in ODOT's legend, we can see ADA ramps and ADA push button categories. They're designated by triangles with 5 categories or by color. Again, those are some of the things that public feedback may help you. Good, fair, poor, missing, not needed. There are some things that aren't needed, but you have to like I said, document that. And the ADA push buttons are designed by squares here, designated by squares with 3 categories. Good, yellow, and good, fair, and poor. So informing the public as to the state of these intersections is very important, so they can go find out their intersection and what's going on here. Again, an example of ODOT's public-facing ADA ramp GIS showing still multiple points of data. Ramp position, where's that ramp at on that corner? Is this ramp closed? Is the ramp style, is it good or non-compliant? And again, you can decide what the public should see. And again, let them see those geometrics. Maybe everything's good, but there's a flare that's steep. Or maybe there's a lip or a discontinuity at the bottom of the flow line of that curb ramp. Let them know that, yeah, you see this and you're going to fix it. In figure 1 here, we see that example of a crosswalk closed support placed as a barrier for peds trying to cross the highway where there are no facilities and lack of adequate shoulder on the other side. So providing a barrier and signage is becoming a best practice. Typically, we only see a barrier or we don't see anything in the form of a buffer area, or sometimes we see a buffer area or a non-walkable surface. So again, if I'm a person who is blind or has a visual impairment, and I try to cross and I'm listening to traffic and I don't know that on the other side of that shoulder, there's no adequate shoulder. This is Oregon's policy, is to create a crosswalk closed, so it's legally crossed across the state. So I like the fact that they're doing that there's a barrier and a sign as well. Here we look at different curb ramps, looked at labeled as poor, right? It's depicted as a red triangle. You can click on that ramp. It says constructed in place, unique design. Here's the reason for it's not compliant. Detectable warnings are bad. No landing slope, which is a slope Y, a lip height, a cross slope. So really quick, we can find out what's non-compliant here. And then we can quickly see that complete intersection. in Oregon and locate the appropriate curb ramp, its corner position, ramp position, and see up the complete list of why this curb ramp is non-compliant. This GIS is great for a quick go-to. You don't have to go out in the field if you're an engineer. Somebody already went out there and showed you what's wrong with that, and you know exactly what to fix. And again, there's also pictures attached to that as well. Here we looked at the ADA push button layer on ODOT's Trans GIS site, and notice that you only see Oregon DOT right-of-way signalized intersections where push buttons are present. The town and city should have their own GIS for curb ramps, sidewalks, and signalized intersections containing push buttons. Remember, the transition plan shall at a minimum identify physical obstacles in the public entities' facilities that limit the accessibility of its programs or activities to individuals with disabilities. And again, that's sidewalk gaps, existing lack of curb ramps, all those things. So this GIS is a quick go-to to say, okay, where are we at? What are we fixing? What's good or bad? We click here, we look at the intersection, we got the ADA push button, we've got the push button, is it good? Does it have an audible signal type of description? Is it a speech message? Is it a countdown? Is it vibrotactile? Is there an arrow? Is it lined up with the crosswalk? Does it vibrate when the crosswalk sign is on during that walk phase? Again, Chris talked about the audible signal type and the MUTCD for sections 4E08 and 4E12. That talks about those requirements for pedestrian signals and the APS requirement, which again we're getting a huge more trend of APS policy. Colorado DOT, as well as any other DOTs, have provided a GIS database for publics to peruse. Again, here's the ADA curb ramp requirements. Here's the intersection. That intersection has that curb ramp, the inspection date, whether it's public, PROAG requirement, PROAG, if it meets PROAG and things like that. And again, then you have photos, and there's the photo of that ramp. So before even going out there, you could see this ramp, and you can see exactly what's wrong with the ramp and what's on this GIS database. And actually, I'm almost done. So again, GIS in and of itself is monumental in providing data for everything in the built environment and for pedestrian facilities within the public right-of-way. This information is collected, can be shared, extracted, and updated to tell the history of existing elements and geometrics from non-compliance to compliance. And again, can conclude your documentation on existing constraints in the design or construction of a facility or element. Again, that's a lot of information for 15 minutes, and thank you for your time. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon Yates, CEO of Deep Walk.